Hi, I'm the Reverend Dr. John Griffiths, and I'm passionate about the Bible. I'm so passionate that I've devoted myself to understanding the Bible. And look, I've been studying it now for 10 years. And I'm really passionate not just about the Bible, but about teaching other people how to read the Bible well. So in this video, I'm going to be looking at how do you read the Gospel of Mark? And in particular, if I was sitting next to you and we had the Gospel of Mark open, what are the three interpretive keys that I would be teaching you so that you could get more out of the Gospel of Mark? Well, that's what we're going to cover in today's video. What are the three interpretive keys for understanding the Gospel of Mark in a deeper and more nuanced way? Well, you see, the first one here is that Jesus' ministry in Galilee reveals certain elements about Jesus' identity. Really, one of the main things in the Gospel of Mark, in these opening chapters from Mark 1 to 8, is the identity of Jesus. Who is this Jesus? And there's really two motifs from the Old Testament that Jesus fulfills in these opening chapters in Mark. We see that Jesus first is depicted as a prophet. In particular, he's depicted as a prophet much like Elijah and Elisha. We see Jesus going around and raising the dead, cleansing the leper, healing the sick, and these are all things that Elijah and Elisha did. We also see Jesus walking around and pronouncing judgments or giving teachings. And again, this is the typical action of what a prophet is. And yet, when we look at Mark's gospel, in these opening chapters, there are other actions that Jesus does that a prophet doesn't do. In particular, when we look at Mark's gospel, Jesus forgives sins. A prophet never has the authority to forgive sins. Secondly, we see that Jesus commands the winds and the waves. And again, this is something that prophets don't do. And so to understand these opening chapters in Mark, we need to see, yes, the base level of what Jesus is doing is that he is a prophet. But then secondly, he's doing things that only Yahweh can do. And there's a couple of different pointers in these opening chapters that show us that Jesus is not just a prophet, but he's so much more. So the first is that John the Baptist rocks up on the scene and he says, "I'm preparing the way for the Lord." Now what's important here is this Lord isn't the Messiah. It's not some sort of other human figure. Rather, John sees himself as preparing the way for Yahweh, the God of Israel. Right. John prepares the way for Yahweh. And then secondly, John says, the person that comes after me will baptize Israel in the Holy Spirit. Now again, this is really important because only God controls the Holy Spirit, right? Only God can baptize Israel in the Holy Spirit. And so these two pointers lead us to see that the one that comes after John will be Yahweh, will be the God of Israel himself. And yet what we see is who comes after John? It's Jesus. And so Jesus isn't just a prophet, but actually Jesus is Yahweh. Jesus is the very embodiment of the God of Israel. And we see that there's 2 points in particular, I've already mentioned them, where Jesus gives us this image into this exalted status that he has. The first is that he forgives sins. And the Pharisees think to themselves, well, I thought that only God could forgive sins. And they're right. Only God, in the Old Testament, only God has the authority to forgive sins. And yet when Jesus walks around seeing these people that need to be healed, he forgives their sins. Now, secondly, what we also see is that Jesus commands the winds and the waves. You remember when Jesus is sleeping in the boat and the disciples become increasingly concerned about the wind and the waves and that the boat will sink and that they'll all die. And they wake Jesus up. Jesus commands the wind and the waves to be still. And they're just awestruck, and these disciples say, "Who is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" And again, this is the exact right question to ask, because in the Old Testament, one of the primary functions of God in creation is that God has authority over the wind and the waves. And I would encourage you, as you read through these opening chapters of Mark, begin to look for these little clues in the Gospels, in these opening chapters, because they'll actually reveal something about the identity of Jesus. Now, the second interpretive key that I would give to you is this idea around Mark's travel narrative. I've got to tell you, of all the broad sections in all the Gospels, Mark's travel narrative is my favorite. It is so beautifully written. And when you begin to see how Mark has crafted this travel narrative, I think it'll be one of your favorite sections of the Gospels as well. You see, Mark, he begins this travel narrative with this idea of seeing and not perceiving. Jesus says to his disciples, "Do you see and not perceive?" Then he heals someone who sees and doesn't perceive. And then Peter proclaims Jesus as the Christ, but then does not perceive what the Christ must do. So we have this repeated theme of seeing and not perceiving, and it repeats 3 times. Do you see and not perceive? Now, Mark's travel narrative is actually structured around what are known as the Passion predictions. Now, the Passion is Jesus' death on the cross. So a Passion prediction is when Jesus predicts that he will go to Jerusalem, that he'll be handed over to the rulers in Jerusalem, that he will suffer and that he will die and that he'll be vindicated on the 3rd day. Now, what we see is in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus predicts this 3 times. There are 3 Passion predictions, and this travel narrative actually is divided into 3 sections with these 3 Passion predictions. Now, what's really fascinating here is that Jesus then, after his Passion predictions, begins to talk about discipleship. He begins to talk about, for instance, picking up your cross and following him. That is, Jesus' Passion predictions, Jesus' ultimate fate in Jerusalem, his willingness to go to Jerusalem and to die and to bear the sins of others, is the very basis for then our discipleship. Jesus' Passion predictions then form the basis for a discussion on discipleship. So we see that there's these 3 sections in Mark's travel narrative. They start with a Passion prediction, then there is a mention of discipleship, and then there is some other form of teaching, whether it's the Transfiguration or on divorce. We see then that this travel narrative concludes by linking back to this idea of seeing and perceiving. Now, what's interesting is that this seeing and perceiving is found in the story of blind Bartimaeus. They're walking, they're leaving Jericho, they're just about to go into Jerusalem, and you have blind Bartimaeus sitting by the side of the road, and he hears that it's Jesus walking by, and he cries out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Now, this is really important because the Son of David, this title, was given to the Messiah. So just as right at the start of the travel narrative, Peter has proclaimed Jesus as the Christ, now right at the end, blind Bartimaeus is proclaiming Jesus as the Christ. And initially, the crowd tell blind Bartimaeus, "Stop, be quiet." He's not quiet. He continues to cry out all the more. And Jesus stops and asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And blind Bartimaeus says, "I want to see." And what happens is that Jesus then heals his sight, and it says he gets up and follows Jesus along the way. That his proclamation of Jesus as the Son of David was actually correct. He had the correct perception. All he needed now was the sight, seeing and perceiving. Now, the third interpretive key that I would be teaching you if you're in my classroom or if I was sitting next to you is that the temple is the focus of Jesus' time in Jerusalem. When Jesus gets to Jerusalem, the first thing that he does is he goes into the temple and he does his demonstration. And it is this thing, this demonstration, that actually leads to the religious leaders wanting to kill Jesus. It's the temple demonstration that leads to Jesus' death. And actually, we see after this demonstration, the teaching that Jesus gives in Jerusalem is really centered around the temple. The question, on what authority do you do this, Jesus? The question is, on what authority do you do this temple demonstration? The parable of the talents is a parable about the temple. And then we also see towards the end of Jesus' time in Jerusalem, we have this Signs of the Times passage. And this passage is really focusing on the temple. What is going to happen to the temple? And Jesus predicts that the temple will be destroyed. We even see at the crucifixion scene, remember the temple is still in view because the veil of the temple is torn open. So the temple is one of the major themes that runs throughout Jesus' time in Jerusalem. Now with this, I would also encourage you to note some of the allusions and some of the intertextuality about Jesus' crucifixion scene in Mark. In particular, what we see is that the Davidic Psalms of Lament are so important. In particular, Psalm 22 and Psalm 69. So as you're reading through Mark's passion narrative, in particular his crucifixion scene, I would have one finger in Psalm 22 and one finger in Psalm 69, because that is going to help you see Jesus as the suffering Messiah. So these are the three interpretive keys that I would be teaching you if I had the tremendous opportunity to teach you face to face about the Gospel of Mark. Now, if you've enjoyed this video, please click like, give me a comment of encouragement or ask me a question. Look, that would really bless me. And if you want to see my other videos about the Gospels, go to my homepage, subscribe, and you'll be able to find them there. I'll see you soon.